November 27th, 1950, 9:47 p.m. A night when the stars themselves seemed to freeze in the sky over North Korea. On the jagged ridges surrounding the Chosin Reservoir, the wind didn't just blow, it screamed like a wounded animal. Marine Corporal James Ransom lay in a foxhole carved from earth that had become harder than the granite it sat upon. His world had shrunk to the space of a few feet, defined by the white mist of his own breath and the biting sting of ice against his skin. The temperature had plummeted to a soul-crushing 36 degrees below zero. At that depth of cold, physics begins to fail. Blood thickens, morphine freezes solid in its tubes, and the very oil designed to lubricate the engines of war turns into a sticky, useless sludge. Ransom reached out with fingers he could no longer feel and pressed them against the trigger of his M1 Garand. He saw a shadow move in the tree line, a flicker of motion in the darkness. He squeezed. Nothing. The rifle remained silent. No recoil, no thunder, just the hollow, terrifying click of a firing pin stuck in a tomb of gelled grease. Around him, across a perimeter held by 8,000 Marines, the realization spread like a contagion. Their weapons were dying. They were surrounded by 120,000 soldiers of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, ghost-like figures moving through the snow, preparing to launch a human wave that should have been their annihilation. But in that moment of absolute despair, a hidden connection existed. Every copper-jacketed bullet in Ransom's ammunition belt, every primer waiting to be struck, was a masterpiece of human intent. They had been forged 10,000 miles away in a place called Independence, Missouri. There, inside the cavernous halls of the Lake City Army ammunition plant, a different kind of war was being fought. It was a war of micrometers and tolerances, fought by 5,621 ordinary people who had been asked to perform a miracle in 30 days. They were the invisible hands that would decide whether James Ransom lived to see the sunrise or became a frozen monument in a forgotten valley. This is not a story of generals or grand strategies. It is the chronicle of the metal, the powder, and the thousands of souls who made sure that when the world froze, the fire of democracy stayed lit. August 10th, 1950. Independence, Missouri. The heat of a Midwestern summer hung heavy over the 3,935 acres of the Lake City Army ammunition plant. For 5 years, this place had been a tomb. The silence was absolute, broken only by the dry rustle of grass growing through cracks in the asphalt. Inside Building 12, Howard Marsh stood with a clipboard, his shadow stretching across rows of machinery that looked like sleeping iron titans. Marsh had been the master of this temple during the final, desperate year of World War II, and now he had been summoned back to wake it up. The orders from the Pentagon were not a request. They were an ultimatum. Washington needed ammunition, not in months, but in 30 days. Millions of rounds were required to feed a war that was consuming men and metal at a rate that terrified the generals. Marsh ran his hand along Press 47, a massive cartridge-forming machine. The hydraulic seals were fossilized, cracked by 5 winters of neglect. The gears were choked with dust, and the very air smelled of stagnant oil and forgotten industry. To any sane engineer, the task was impossible. It would take 60 days just to recalibrate the precision dies. And yet, the Marines were already boarding troop ships in San Diego, their pouches half empty. But Marsh knew something the generals didn't. He knew the people of Missouri. He picked up the telephone and began a resurrection. The calls went out to the farms of Blue Springs, the small shops of Raytown, and the quiet porches of Kansas City. He wasn't calling employees. He was calling ghosts of the greatest generation. Men in their late 40s who had traded their coveralls for hardware stores and gas stations. Women who had spent years inspecting primers with a jeweler's precision before returning to the domestic peace of the suburbs. By late August, the gates of Lake City swung open. They arrived by the thousands. 5,621 souls who understood that a letter from the government wasn't about a paycheck. It was about a debt of survival. They walked past the guard shacks, through the security checkpoints where lighters and matches were confiscated like contraband. They entered the cavernous buildings and began a brutal race against time. They scrubbed rust with raw fingers, replaced cracked belts, and breathed life back into machines that had produced 7 billion rounds during the previous war. On September 12th, the silence finally broke. Building 3 roared to life with a rhythmic pounding that vibrated through the floorboards and deep into the chests of every worker. The first line was operational. The giants were awake, and they were hungry for brass. By October 1950, the Lake City plant had become a living, breathing beast of metal and fire. It was no longer a factory. It was a 24-hour symphony of industrial desperation. The machines ran until the steel grew hot to the touch, and the workers moved in a blur of synchronized labor. There was no day or night in Building 9, only the rhythm, a relentless, bone-shaking pounding that occurred every 4 seconds. Draw the brass, anneal the metal, trim the edge, inspect for cracks. Every 8-hour shift saw 28,000 repetitions. The sound didn't just stay in your ears, it lived in your skull, following the workers home to their beds, echoing in their dreams. The air inside the assembly halls was thick, smelling of hot machine oil, burnt gunpowder, and the metallic tang of raw copper. But amidst this chaotic noise, there was a sacred silence at the inspection tables. This was where the invisible hands did their most vital work. Consider Dorothy Chen, a 42-year-old widow who sat under the flicker of a magnifying lamp on the graveyard shift. Her husband's life had ended on the beaches of Normandy, and now she spent her nights ensuring no other woman would receive that same telegram because of a faulty bullet. Dorothy's world was the size of a postage stamp. She inspected primers, tiny brass cups no larger than a pencil eraser, filled with a compound so volatile that a stray spark of static electricity could turn the building into a crater. Her eyes, strained and weary, searched for flaws invisible to the naked eye. A hairline fracture in the cup. A microscopic dent in the anvil. A powder charge off by a single milligram. To anyone else, it was just a piece of scrap. To Dorothy, it was a click. In the heat of combat, a click instead of a bang is the last sound a soldier ever hears. It is the sound of a mother's son failing to defend himself. She rejected one in every 500. By the end of her shift, she had a bucket weighing 18 pounds filled with potential deaths that would never happen. 18 pounds of failures that she personally intercepted. She never knew the names of the Marines who would carry her past ammunition, but she felt their presence in every breath. Beside her, workers like Robert Tillman at the powder-filling station operated with the same terrifying gravity. Tillman didn't just measure 46.5 grains of IMR powder. He measured the stability of a nation. If he was off by half a grain, the rifle would explode in the Marine's hands. And at Lake City, there was no room for almost. There was only perfect, and there was failure. And for 5,621 workers, failure was a word they had stricken from the dictionary of 1950, November 27th, 1950, 10 p.m. Korean time. The silence on the ridges of the Chosin Reservoir was shattered by a sound that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The high, shrill scream of thousand-year-old war bugles. From the frozen mist, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army descended like a white tidal wave. They didn't come with tanks or heavy artillery. They came with whistles, grenades, and a terrifying, relentless human courage. Corporal James Ransom, his hands trembling from a cold that felt like liquid nitrogen, faced the ultimate nightmare. His M1 Garand was a frozen club. The oil had turned to stone. In a moment of primal desperation, he did what his training never taught him, but survival demanded. He unbuttoned his fly and urinated directly onto the rifle's bolt. The steam rose in the sub-zero air, and the brief, frantic warmth thawed the sludge. He slammed the bolt forward. It ground like gravel, but it locked. He aimed at a silhouette charging through the snow and squeezed the trigger. Bang! The sound was more than a gunshot. It was a miracle of engineering. 10,000 miles away, at that exact moment, Frank Myers was sprinting across the floor of Building 3 in Lake City. He had heard a wrong note in the symphony, a metallic grinding on press 23. A hairline fracture had appeared on a forming punch. If it shattered, the line would die for 6 hours. 6 hours meant 120,000 rounds that would never reach the front. Myers didn't wait for a supervisor. He killed the power, his hands moving with a blurred efficiency born of 1,000 shifts, and replaced the steel punch in 22 minutes. Production never faltered. While the Marines at Chosin fired 6 million rounds in 17 days of hell, those bullets never failed. In a climate so hostile it turned blood plasma into ice and froze morphine solid, the Missouri steel and brass held true. The primers ignited, the powder burned at the exact velocity required, and the bullets left the barrels at 2,800 feet per second. The Chinese came in waves, pouring down slopes so steep they should have been impassable, but they ran into a wall of lead, forged by people like Dorothy Chen and Frank Myers. Every LC-50 stamped on those casings was a promise kept. The Marines were surrounded, outnumbered 10-1, and fighting in a frozen purgatory. But they had one certainty. When they pulled the trigger, the world would explode in front of them. The ammunition didn't just work. It became the only currency of survival. The guns of the Korean War finally fell silent in July 1953. But the echo of the Lake City Army ammunition plant continued to resonate through the decades. By the end of the conflict, those 5,621 workers had produced a staggering 6 billion rounds of ammunition. To understand the scale of that achievement, consider this. It was more than the entire American expenditure during the First World War. But the true miracle wasn't the quantity. It was the zero. Out of 3,000 separate lots of ammunition produced, Lake City achieved a 0% failure rate in lot acceptance testing. In the cold calculus of war, where a single defective primer can cost a life, they had achieved perfection. The workers of Lake City never asked for medals. They went back to their lives in Missouri, to their gardens, their grandchildren, and their quiet Sundays. Dorothy Chen retired in 1961, taking with her a small wooden box containing 12 rejected primers, the ones she caught, the ones that never made it to Korea. They were her silent rosary, a reminder of the responsibility she carried every night under that magnifying lamp. Frank Myers stayed until 1972, always proud not of the millions of rounds he shipped, but of the single bad round he prevented from leaving the building. They were the invisible architecture of victory, people whose names never graced history books, but whose hands held the line. The connection between the factory floor and the frozen ridge was finally made visible in 1992. A group of survivors from the Chosin Reservoir, men now in their 70s, with weathered faces and silver hair, travelled to Independence, Missouri. They walked through the same buildings where their ammunition had been forged 42 years earlier. There, among the roaring presses, they met the few remaining workers from the 1950 era. One veteran, Thomas Caffey, stood before Alice Brennan, an old woman who had once been a sharp-eyed inspector. He looked at her hands, the hands that had touched the brass he once fired, and whispered, "My rifle never jammed, not once in 17 days of hell. I fired 963 rounds and every single one went off." Alice nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "That's all we wanted," she replied, "for them to work when you needed them." In that 30-second exchange, the entire history of the arsenal of democracy was summarized. It was the covenant of war, an unspoken agreement that if a soldier gives his life, the worker must give his soul to the machine. Today, the Lake City plant still stands, still stamping out the brass and lead that defend freedom. But the ghost of 1950 remains, a reminder that in the face of impossible odds, ordinary people doing extraordinary work are the strongest link in the chain of human survival.